Herzlich willkommen, herzlichen Glückwunsch zu deiner erfolgreichen Verteidigung der Promotion und wir freuen uns jetzt sehr, Schravan, dass du uns die Hauptpunkte in deiner Dissertation hier im Cluster vorstellen wirst.
Dankeschön. So, soll ich beginnen? Okay, Dankeschön. So, today, hello everybody, my name is Shravan Kumar, and today I will be presenting my PhD thesis, and the title is The Impact of Governance on Efficiency, and here we perform case studies on airports and seaports. So the focus of the research is as follows. The focus is to analyze the performance impact of ownership structure. Here we will focus mainly on the role of public-private partnerships. The next focus is to analyze the performance impact of competition. And here we will analyze the role of excessive entry and overcapacity. And the last focus is to analyze the performance impact of economic regulation. And here we will analyze the role of regulatory reforms and also the role of independent economic regulators. So this is the overview of the presentation. The presentation is split into 3 papers. The first paper is titled, Does Regulation Improve Efficiency? The Case of Airports. And the second paper analyzes the impact of specialization, ownership, competition, and regulation efficiency. And here we perform a case study of Indian seaports. And third paper analyzes the impact of governance on the technical efficiency of container ports. So let's start off with the first paper. So the focus of the research of the first paper are twofold. The first is to analyze the impact on efficiency and airport charges of different market structures and regulatory environments. And the second focus is to review the literature on the impact of regulation on airport performance and charges. So this is basically a literature review paper. So here are the different market structures, regulatory environments, and their impact on efficiency. We start off with a monopoly. With the monopoly, there is the restriction of output and unexploited economies of scale, which has a negative impact on efficiency. And it also can lead to Liebenstein-X inefficiency, which also has a negative impact on efficiency. With respect to a competitive market, in a competitive market, regulation of airports can distort efficiency, which has a negative impact on efficiency. And then we come to the 3 forms of regulation that are of focus in this paper. The first is rate of return regulation. With rate of return regulation, it leads to lower charges, which increase output in comparison to a monopolist, which has a positive impact on efficiency. However, with rate of return regulation, airports have no incentive to set peak prices, which has a negative impact on efficiency. And it can also lead to the Howard-Johnson effect, gold plating, and cost padding, which also has a negative impact on efficiency. With respect to single-till rate of return regulation, this restricts potentially competitive commercial activities, which has a negative impact on efficiency. And then there is dual-till rate of return regulation. Here, higher charges decrease output in comparison to single-till rate of return regulation, which also has a negative impact on efficiency. And then we come to the next form of regulation, which is price cap regulation. With price cap regulation, peak pricing promotes allocative efficiency, which has a positive impact on efficiency, and it also encourages cost efficiency, which also has a positive impact on efficiency. However, underinvestment deteriorates quality of service, which has a negative impact on efficiency. With respect to single-till price cap regulation, this leads to lower caps compared to dual-till, which has a positive impact. However, it creates weak incentives to earn commercial revenues, which has a negative impact. Then we come to dual-till price cap regulation. This encourages airports to lower aeronautical charges, thus increase passenger throughput, which has a positive impact. And commercial revenues are unrestricted with dual-till price cap. So this also has a positive impact. The last form of regulation is light-handed regulation. So with respect to light-handed regulation, with a credible threat and an arbitration mechanism in place, this encourages cost efficiency and output-oriented allocative efficiency, which has a positive impact. This is also flexible with a low amount of regulatory burden, which also has a positive impact. Moreover, a congested airport has the incentive to practice peak pricing, and an airport with excess capacity has the incentive to pursue Ramsay pricing, which also has a positive impact. Lastly, we focus on regulatory institutions. So here the focus is on an independent regulator. An independent regulator provides long-term commitment for immobile and specialized investment, which has a positive impact. And an independent regulator also prevents charges and costs from increasing above the optimal level, which also has a positive impact. So now we come to the literature review. The first set of studies show that regulation impacts positively on the estimated levels of efficiency. So the first study is by Asaf in 2010, who analyzes the cost efficiency of airports in Australia, and he finds that light-handed regulation leads to cost efficiency. The next study is by Asaf et al. 2012, who analyzed the cost efficiency of airports in the UK, and they find that price cap regulated airports are more cost efficient than airports which are not price cap regulated. Boteso and Conti 2012 estimate a variable cost function for airports in the UK, and they find that technical efficiency increased due to regulation. Next, we come to Kuri et al. 2011, who analyzed both the operational and the financial efficiency of airports in Italy, and they find that dual-till price cap regulation improved financial efficiency, but surprisingly, in their model, operational efficiency drops. Adler et al. 2015 analyzed the technical efficiency of airports in Europe and Australia, and they find that incentive regulation leads to higher productive efficiency in comparison to cost-plus regulation. Adler and Liebert 2014 analyzed the cost efficiency of airports in Europe and Australia, and their results are quite interesting. They find that under weak competition, economic regulation is necessary, and privately owned dual-tail price cap regulated airports are more efficient than their unregulated counterparts. However, in a competitive environment, they find that regulation is unnecessary, and they find that purely public and purely private unregulated airports operate equally cost efficiently. Karamki and Lim 2020 analyzed the technical efficiency of airports in the United States, and they find that compensatory and hybrid use agreements positively impact efficiency. The last study here is Cambini and Congiu 2022, who estimate an average cost function for airports in Italy, and they find that dual-till price cap regulation with the negotiation procedure reduces the average cost of the regulated airports. Now, the next study shows that regulation does not impact efficiency estimates. So this study is by Randy and Arisoa et al. 2015, who analyzed the variable factor productivity of airports in Europe. And they find that there is no significant difference in operating efficiency of airports, whether they are regulated or not. Now, the next set of studies show that regulation impacts efficiency estimates negatively. So the first study is by Asaf and Gillen 2012, who analyzed the technical efficiency of airports in Europe, North America, and Australia. And they find that private airports subject to minimal economic regulation are the most efficient. And they find that government-owned single-till cost-based regulated airports are the least efficient. Asaf et al. 2014 analyzed the technical cost and allocative efficiency of airports in Europe, North America, and Australia, and they find that economic regulation leads to reduced short-run technical efficiency. The last study is by C and Lee 2015, who analyzed the total factor productivity of airports in UK, and they find that regulated airports attain lower productivity growth rates than unregulated airports. Now, the last set of studies analyze the impact of regulation on charges. So here, the first study is by Bell and Fagida 2010, who estimate a pricing equation for airports in Europe. And they find that the type of regulation, whether rate of return or price cap, has no significant effect on charges. Moreover, they also find that unregulated private airports impose higher aeronautical charges than their public counterparts. Vilotkaj et al. 2012 also estimate a pricing equation for airports in Europe, and they find that single-till regulated airports impose lower charges than dual-till regulated airports. They also find that the type of regulation, whether rate of return or price cap, has no significant effect on charges. And they find that privatized regulated airports impose lower aeronautical charges. The last study is by Adler and Liebert 2014, who also estimate a pricing equation for airports in Europe and Australia. And they find that unregulated private airports impose higher charges than their public counterparts. So this is the literature review. So to conclude, we find that incentive and light-handed regulation positively impact technical and cost efficiency. Moreover, we also find that dual-till incentive regulation is the most preferred form of regulation. From Cambini and Congiu 2022, we find that independent regulators promote cost efficiency. With respect to charges, we find that single-till regulated airports impose lower charges than dual-till regulated airports. But perhaps surprisingly, the type of regulation, whether rate of return or price cap, has no significant effect on charges. We have also identified some avenues for future research. The first is the rate of return regulation and the Howard-Johnson effect. The second is price cap regulation and underinvestment and lower service quality. The third avenue for future research is peak pricing, allocative efficiency, and the regulation of airports with excess demand. The next avenue for future research is investment regulation and its performance impact. Finally, light-handed regulation in Australia, Copenhagen, and Gatwick also requires some future research. So this is the first paper. Now we come to the second paper. The second paper analyzes the impact of specialization, ownership, competition, and regulation on efficiency. And here we perform a case study of Indian seaports. So the focus of the research is as follows. The focus is to estimate the impact on technical efficiency of specialization, ownership structure, competition, and economic regulation. We analyze the impact of these factors on the technical efficiency of the major Indian seaports from 1995 to 2015. So here are the hypotheses. The first hypothesis states that specialization has a positive impact on technical efficiency, but at a decreasing rate. The second hypothesis states that a higher degree of external stakeholder participation in seaport operations leads to higher technical efficiency. The third hypothesis states that a higher level of competition between federal and state-owned seaports encourages improvements in technical efficiency of the federal seaports. The fourth hypothesis states that tariff regulation by an independent or partly independent regulator is more efficiency-inducing than internally regulated seaports. Finally, the last hypothesis states that regulation of competition for the market leads to optimal bidding by cargo handling companies. So here is the overview of the data and the methodology. We have data on 11 major Indian seaports from 1995 to 2015. We perform a two-stage analysis here. In the first stage, we perform a variable returns to scale slacks-based measure of efficiency. And then in the second stage, we perform fixed effects regressions. So this is the mathematical program for the variable returns to scale slacks-based measure of efficiency. So we choose this model mainly because of two of its desirable properties. Firstly, this is a non-oriented model, which means we can minimize inputs and maximize outputs simultaneously. And the second advantage is that this is a non-radial measure of efficiency, which means an inefficient observation can find the closest path to the efficiency frontier. And these are the two reasons for us to choose this measure of efficiency. So this is the data for the slacks-based measure of efficiency. We have 5 inputs and 3 outputs. The first input is a measure of capital, which is the depreciation of the port authority's assets plus the finance and miscellaneous expenditure. The second measure is also a measure of capital, which is the number of berths. The third measure is a measure of variable costs. Here we use the operating expenditure minus the depreciation of the port authority's assets minus the expenses on salaries and wages. So depreciation has been removed because depreciation is already being used as a measure of capital. And we also remove the expenses on salaries and wages because we have a separate input for labor. Then we come to the fourth input, which is labor. Here we use the number of non-cargo handling officers and workers. Finally, we have the last input, which is a measure of capital or a cargo handling labor proxy. Here we use the number of cranes. With respect to the outputs, we have 3 outputs. We have the total number of vessels handled, the total volume of cargo handled, and we have a quality of service output, which is the reciprocal of the average turnaround time. So we estimate 3 models in the first stage. Model A has 3 inputs, capital, variable costs, and labor, but it has only 2 outputs, vessels and cargo. Model B has the same inputs as in Model A, but it has 1 extra output. It has vessels, cargo, and the quality of service. The third model is a principal components analysis data envelopment analysis model. So the first input is the first principal component of capital and the number of berths. The second input is the first principal component of labor and the number of cranes. And the third input is the variable costs. On the output side, we have the same outputs as in Model B, vessels, cargo, and the quality of service. Now, this is our second stage regression model. So the efficiency from the first stage becomes the dependent variable in the second stage analysis. And then we have specialization, which is the Keeble and Hauser Herfindahl-Hirschman index. For ownership, we use the berth level extent of external stakeholder participation. So for competition, we measure the competition between the state seaports and the federal seaports. And we measure competition within the state, along the coast, and competition originating from the opposite coast. So this is the spatial measure of competition. And then finally, the Indian major seaports are regulated by an independent regulator, namely the Tariff Authority for Major Seaports. And we use the regulatory guidelines published by the Tariff Authority for Major Seaports in order to measure the impact of regulation on efficiency. So this is how the variables are measured. So specialization is the Keeble and Hausser-Herfindahl-Huisman index. And in order to test whether specialization affects efficiency at a decreasing rate, we also construct a categorical variable of specialization. So we have 5 levels: specialization below 60%, specialization between 60 and 70%, specialization between 70 and 80%, specialization between 80 and 90%, and specialization above 90%. For ownership, we use the birth level extent of external stakeholder participation, and then we split this into 3 levels, namely between 0 and 33% external stakeholder participation at the level of the birth, between 33 and 66% external stakeholder participation at the level of the birth, and above 66% external stakeholder participation at the level of the birth. With respect to competition, we have a continuous variable. So this is a distance weighted measure of competition. So the cargo handled by the state, the cargo handled by the competing state seaport goes in the numerator, and then the distance between the competing state seaport and the central seaport under consideration goes in the denominator. And then we perform a summation to include all competing state seaports within the predefined geographic zone. And then we have regulation. We have 7 levels. So before 1998, there was internal regulation. Thereafter, the Tariff Authority for Major Ports was set up, and they started publishing regulatory guidelines. So we use the date of publication of the regulatory guidelines to construct 6 more dummy variables. That is the guidelines of 1998, the guidelines of 2003, the ones of 2005, the guidelines of 2008, 2013, and 2015. So here are our first stage port-wise results. So what we find in all the 3 models is that 4 seaports are performing consistently very well. So these are the Jawaharlal Nehru Port Trust, the New Mangalore Port Trust, Kandla, and Tuticorin. We observe that all the other seaports have significant scope for performance improvement. And then these are the first stage average annual efficiencies. So we see that efficiency initially dropped till 1998, and then it improved till 2007. Thereafter, there is another drop in efficiency, and this drop went on till 2012, and then efficiency started improving again from 2013 onwards. So here are the second stage regression results. So from the first 3 columns, we find that specialization has a significant positive impact on the technical efficiency of the major Indian seaports. And then the next 3 columns measure the impact of specialization, which has been classified as a categorical variable. Here, we find that specialization has a positive impact on efficiency even at higher levels of specialization. So we only partly accept our first hypothesis because specialization has a positive impact on efficiency, and the positive impact on efficiency is sustained even at higher levels of specialization. And then we come to the impact of ownership on efficiency. So we find that external stakeholder participation at a level of 33 to 66% and external stakeholder participation at a level of above 66% have a significant positive impact on the technical efficiency of the major Indian seaports in comparison to the base case. So we also accept our second hypothesis, which states that external stakeholder participation has a positive impact on the technical efficiency of the seaports. And then we come to the impact of competition. So as you can see from the first column, what we find is that competition between the state seaports and central seaports within a state and competition between the state seaports and the central seaports along the coast have a significant negative impact on the performance of the major Indian seaports. So these results are quite surprising, and hence we reject the third hypothesis, which states that competition has a positive impact on technical efficiency. So what could be the reason? We argue that this is because there is a tiered governance framework for state seaports and the central seaports. So what we are finding is that the state seaports are benefiting at the expense of the major Indian seaports. And this is also leading to some excessive entry and overcapacity because of the tiered governance framework. And now we come to the impact of regulation. So we find that internal regulation leads to a significantly lower technical efficiency in comparison to the base case. Hence, we accept our fourth hypothesis, which states that regulation by an independent or a partly independent regulator have a significant positive impact on technical efficiency. And we also find that the TAMP 1998 guidelines have a significant negative impact on technical efficiency with respect to the base case. So in 1998, competition for the market was not taken into account. So the bids that were offered by the cargo handling companies or the terminal operators was allowed to pass through as costs. So the cargo handling companies would bid higher and then pass these through as costs, which means the cargo handling rates would be higher. But in 2003, this was changed. In 2003, they decided that only the bids by the second highest bidder can pass through as costs, and this pass-through is not valid after the terminal operator starts making profits. So what we are finding is that the TAMP 1998 guidelines lead to a significantly lower technical efficiency in comparison to the base case. So we hence accept our fifth hypothesis, which states that regulation of competition for the market leads to optimal bids being offered by the cargo handling companies. And then we find that from 2005 onwards, all the guidelines have a significant positive impact on the technical efficiency of the major Indian seaports. So in 2003, the charges were based on the return on equity, but this was changed to a return on capital in 2005, and this seems to have a positive impact on performance. In 2008, they introduced upfront tariff fixations, which also seem to have a positive impact on the technical efficiency of the seaports. And in 2013 and 2015, they included performance terms in the regulatory guidelines. They included performance clauses in the regulatory guidelines. And these also seem to have a significant positive impact on the technical efficiency of the major Indian seaports. So to conclude, we find that there is a gradual improvement in average efficiency levels. We argue that the port should follow a landlord seaport model because external stakeholder participation has a significant positive impact on performance. And we also argue that they should follow the landlord seaport model with a specialization objective. And this is because we find that specialization has a significant positive impact on performance. And because competition in the tiered governance framework has a negative impact on the performance of the major Indian seaports, we argue that there should be a common governance and regulatory framework for all the seaports in the country, regardless of whether they are state or centrally owned seaports. And finally, we find that the regulation by the partly independent regulator is efficiency enhancing. However, we argue that regulation can be reformed and we could introduce, for example, price cap regulation or light-handed regulation to regulate all the seaports in the country. So these are our conclusions from the second paper. Now we come to the third paper, which analyzes the impact of governance on the technical efficiency of container ports. So the focus of the research is to estimate the impact on technical efficiency of ownership structure, competition. Here we measure the impact of both hinterland and transshipment competition. And then the third focus is to analyze the impact of economic regulation. And here the focus is on institutional regulation. In order to analyze the impact of these factors, we estimate a production frontier for container ports from the Far East and Asian region. So these are the hypotheses. The first hypothesis states that private participation and the landlord seaport model have a positive impact on technical efficiency. The second hypothesis states that container ports facing high hinterland competition are more technically efficient than those facing low hinterland competition. The third hypothesis states that transshipment competition has a positive impact on the technical efficiency of container ports. The fourth hypothesis states that deregulation positively impacts the technical efficiency of container ports. And then the final hypothesis states that a majority private container port that faces high hinterland competition and has no economic regulation is the most technically efficient. So we estimate production frontiers. The inputs used are the berth length, terminal area, and the number of cranes. And the output used is the TEU handled annually. And then we measure both the individual and the combined effects of the contextual variables on technical efficiency. So for the individual effects, we have ownership, hinterland competition, transshipment competition, and regulation. For the combined effects, we treat transshipment competition separately, and then we have the combinations of ownership, hinterland competition, and economic regulation. So we estimate two models in this research. The first model is a translog production frontier with technical change, where the individual effects of the contextual variables explain inefficiency. The second model is also a translaw production frontier with technical change, but the combined effects of the contextual variables explain technical inefficiency. So we can also perform some diagnostics. We can get the elasticities, the returns to scale, technical change, and the technical efficiency. So this is the overview of the data. We source the data from the Containerization International Yearbooks. We have an unbalanced panel data set that spans 25 years with 591 observations of 43 ports from 12 countries. So this is how the contextual variables for the individual effects are measured. So for ownership, we have minority private and majority private container ports. For hinterland competition, we measure this as the number of container ports within a radius of 1,000 kilometers. We also make an assumption that ports on separate islands do not compete for hinterland traffic. And hinterland competition is classified as low if there are less than or equal to 10 container ports within a radius of 1,000 kilometers. It is classified as moderate if there are between 11 and 20 container ports within a radius of 1,000 kilometers. And it is classified as high if there are above 20 container ports within a radius of 1,000 kilometers. For transshipment competition, we assume that this occurs between ports with capacity to handle post-Panamax 2 vessels. So the port should have a berth length of at least 340 meters and a draft of at least 15 meters. We make the further assumption that transshipment ports compete with all other transshipment ports for transshipment traffic. And for regulation, most ports in Asia have cost-based regulation. So the focus here is on the institutional aspect of regulation. So the ports can be regulated either by the Ministry of Transport Shipping, by the Port Authority, by an independent regulator, or they can have no economic regulation. So this is how the contextual variables for the combined effects model are measured. So ownership and regulation stays the same as in the individual effects model, but for competition, we have only two levels. So competition is classified as low if there are less than or equal to 10 container ports in a radius of 1,000 kilometers, and competition is classified as high if there are more than 10 container ports within a radius of 1,000 kilometers. So here are the results of here are the first set of results, and this shows the coefficients of the inputs and time. These results are quite interesting. However, I will not discuss these results because of a lack of time. And I come directly to the impact of the contextual variables on technical efficiency. So these are the individual effects. This is the individual effects model. So here, a negative sign means it has a positive impact on efficiency. So with respect to ownership, we find that minority private container ports are significantly less technically efficient than majority private container ports. So hence we accept our first hypothesis. With respect to competition, ports which face high hinterland competition are taken as the base case. And we find that ports which face low and moderate hinterland competition are significantly less technically efficient than those that face high hinterland competition. Hence, we also accept our second hypothesis. With respect to transshipment competition, we find that ports which face transshipment competition are significantly more technically efficient than those that face no transshipment competition. So hence, we also accept our third hypothesis. Our results with respect to regulation are interesting. So a port which faces no economic regulation is taken as the base case. And regulation by the Ministry of Transport Shipping leads to a significantly lower technical efficiency in comparison to the base case. So we argue that this is happening because the Ministry of Transport Shipping is susceptible to regulatory capture. And then we come to the other two institutions. So we find that regulation by an independent regulator and regulation by the Port Authority lead to a significantly higher technical efficiency in comparison to the base case. Hence, we reject our fourth hypothesis because it's not deregulation, but it is the type of regulation, the type of institution that regulates that significantly impacts technical efficiency. So deregulation does not have a positive impact on technical efficiency, but regulation by an independent regulator and by the Port Authority have a significantly higher technical efficiency in comparison to having no economic regulation. And then we come to the combined effects model. So here, transshipment competition is treated separately, and we find that ports which face transshipment competition are significantly more technically efficient than those that face no transshipment competition. So these results are similar to the results obtained in Model 1. And now we come to the combined effects. So majority private container port, which faces high hinterland competition and has no economic regulation, is taken as the base case. And what we find is that the base case results in a significantly higher technical efficiency in comparison to most of the other combinations of the contextual variables, with two exceptions. These exceptions are a majority private container port which faces low hinterland competition and is regulated by an independent regulator, and a majority private container port which faces low hinterland competition and has no economic regulation. So these results are again quite surprising, and we argue that this is happening because there is excessive entry. As a result, a majority private container port which faces low hinterland competition and is regulated by an independent regulator is the most technically efficient. Hence, we reject our fifth hypothesis. So, to conclude, we find that majority private ports have a higher technical efficiency in comparison to minority private ports. We find that ports with high hinterland competition have a higher technical efficiency in comparison to ports with low and moderate hinterland competition. We find that ports with transshipment competition have a higher technical efficiency in comparison to ports with no transshipment competition. With respect to regulation, we find that ports regulated by the Ministry of Transport Shipping have a lower technical efficiency compared to unregulated ports. And we find that ports regulated by the Port Authority or an independent regulator have a higher technical efficiency compared to unregulated ports. Coming to the combined effects, we find that ports which are majority private, face high hinterland competition and have no regulation are often the most efficient. Nevertheless, ports which are majority private, face low hinterland competition and have no regulation have a higher technical efficiency in comparison to the base case. Moreover, ports which are majority private, face low hinterland competition and have an independent regulator have a higher technical efficiency in comparison to the base case. Finally, in comparing these two levels, we find that when ports are majority private and have low hinterland competition, regulation by an independent regulator is the best. So we can also draw some general conclusions from my thesis. So the first is that public-private partnerships and the landlord seaport model are efficiency enhancing. The second is that competition can be efficiency enhancing. However, excessive entry and overcapacity leads to competition which can harm efficiency. In the case of airports, we find that regulatory reforms in the form of price cap regulation and light-handed regulation are shown to positively impact airport efficiency. Finally, from all the three papers, we find that independent regulators have a significant positive impact on efficiency. So these are the general conclusions that we can draw. So that is it from my side for now. I hope that we have a very interesting discussion. Thank you.